Excellent. Last session of the day. I'm literally standing between you and the after party. So let's make this an interactive one. Please shoot out those Slido questions throughout the session, and I'm more than happy to just focus on those, give more time on those as we go forward. But first, some slides, so we'll get those over with as well. So very briefly, hi, I'm Karl. I'm a consultant. I talk cloud, I talk security, and nowadays, as everyone, a bit of AI on top of that as well. So as part of my day job, I do consult mostly enterprises, but I do have a background I had a real job. I was an engineer. Now it's mostly hand waving and PowerPoint instead of PowerShell most of the time, but still a lot of fun. So this is really this whole talk is based on around a specific experience, specific case. So a year ago or so, if someone remembers, there was this thing called generative AI. ChatGPT had just come out a couple of months before, and Microsoft rushed also out, labeled the generally available label on top of their own version of the product that as well. But basically, I was working with this massive banking organization, usually very slow-moving, usually very kind of let's do everything right. Especially this kind of not invented here. They would rather build stuff from scratch for years to make things absolutely right, not get flagged in audits, that sort of stuff. But now with generative AI, everything changed. So now they suddenly were like, hey, we are doing this. Can you? We are now doing this generative AI thing. We are using Microsoft Azure. Microsoft told us that it's now generally available. It's ready. It's done. Microsoft has this great security story on top of this. Can you just, a few sprints? I'm sure it's going to be, just a couple of weeks. You're going to get this right, and we can get to using this Gen AI stuff and save the industry, whatever. And as a consultant or improviser or whatever, sure. How hard could this really be? I've done multiple other Azure projects before. I've heard about this AI stuff before. I know math. What could go wrong, right? Well, it's a whole talk. So let's get into it. So this was my plan then. So I'm kind of going through the same workflow or same flow of logic that I was going through with the client, and it's a bit of lessons learned, but also the kind of benefit of hindsight as we go through this session. And as a reminder, please do ask those questions in the Slido throughout the session. Then we have a good backlog to start going through them at the end of a few minutes there. So basically, very briefly, even though they knew that they wanted to do this in this enterprise part on the Azure side, they did want to understand what are these kind of different hosting models available, how to get it working on their Azure environment, kind of sandbox, kind of disconnected environment, and how to put it together with their existing, enterprise landing zones, continuously audited environment, et cetera, et cetera. So that was our plan, and that's what we are going to follow now. Okay, so very briefly, I'm kind of summarizing. At that time, there was this thing called ChatGPT free, plus I don't think was announced back then, and there was a blog post announcing ChatGPT Enterprise, and that was pretty much it. So this is a little bit kind of updated version. This is where we are right now. There are these different versions of the ChatGPT, which is, I'm sure someone who is either from OpenAI, from Microsoft, if they're in the room, they can comment the exact legal approved language, but it is similar in features, but not code sharing, whatever the official language there is, but very similar in terms of features and capabilities, but not exactly the same thing, but close enough for our purposes. So basically, we were looking at this ChatGPT versus Azure OpenAI. What's the difference? What can we get out of the box from this software as a service version in the ChatGPT world? And what can we get this on the platform as a service world on Azure OpenAI? Nowadays, there's also this approach from some of the vendors, also from Microsoft. There's this, if you're all familiar with the cloud shared responsibility matrix, there is this similar shared responsibility matrix now available for AI services as well. So from that perspective, you can also kind of think of this as software as a service on the left and more control available for us, more closer to platform as a service on the right. And then what's kind of missing from here is basically the part that then would add somewhere over here the kind of bring your own model, host your own infra type of stuff. Then this will be the kind of closest thing to infrastructure as a service there. But very briefly, there is this free version from ChatGPT. There is a claim that enterprise gives you some more features. It does claim some features. You can go to their trust center, sign up for an NDA, take a look at their reports, and you'll understand that there's some more features. There's actually an SSO integration coming up. There is domain allow listing that you can do for hooking up your team members so that you can actually have shared workspaces. And then there are some weird features such as this encryption at rest. I'm very curious, knowing that this is built on exactly the same technology. This is built on Azure Kubernetes Service and Cosmos DB. After this session, I don't need to break any NDAs. If someone can tell me how can they say that encryption at rest is not available for the free tier, please let me know, because I couldn't get it working mentally on my side. But there are some things that are a little bit more kind of slideware, and some that are kind of technical differences there. So basically, if you use ChatGPT first-party services, it's kind of closer to software as a service. It really doesn't give you that much security features or, from an enterprise perspective, controls in there. And then there is this Azure OpenAI service. There's kind of TLDR. Apparently I have animations, so let's open those up. So basically there are those free and plus versions. There's some other versions coming up nowadays as well. Both are really based on the same thing. Both are apparently hosted only in the US. If you're coming from somewhere else or working on different locations, like this bank had to have an environment for Europe, had to have an environment for multiple Asian environments as well. They didn't have the opportunity to just go for this kind of globally hosted or hosted in one place only environment. And otherwise, my kind of own personal TLDR is that you get a little bit of more kind of paid privacy, or at least a promise for paid privacy if you choose for that. But if you need to choose, bring your own keys for encryption, if you need to have some network controls, etc., pretty much your option quite easily is the Azure OpenAI service, which obviously it's in the name of the talk. So hopefully no one's surprised that we chose that for what we were doing there. So let's start looking at it. So as I said, I come from that Azure background. I was like, yeah, it's a new Azure service. It's supposedly even in general availabilities, which means that it should have passed through all of those quality gates. It should have all of those bells and whistles that any Azure service that is claimed that is labeled generally available, production ready. So the general approach for this that I had, and that you should be able to replicate the similar approach overall, is this kind of concept of Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark. So this is really just this beautiful origami of different type of outside requirements. So from an auditor's perspective or from a CISO's perspective, if you need to be compliant with, dozens of different outside security requirements. There's usually you will just do all of this work in Excel and then try to prove to an auditor that yes, the fact that you click here or the fact that you have encryption on really ticks these and these security boxes in whatever CIS control framework, etc., etc. Now Microsoft has done that part for us, so that should be the part that you should get started with. So there's documentation, there's policies, there's technical controls available for all of the services built by the same product teams. So again, at least in theory, any product who goes through this, it's the product group's responsibility on Microsoft, on their side, to actually produce this cloud security benchmark controls and documentation in there. Fantastic. For the first 10 months, there wasn't anything. So just like the client, Also in this case, our cloud partner had also skipped a little bit ahead and skipped all of their internal processes, internal kind of best practices on this side, and just focused purely on just getting it out of the door and hoping that eventually the features will catch on. But now, since September, October, can't recall, now we have these control security benchmark available. There's 35 controls that are responsibility of the client or user of the cloud, and 7 of them are actually provided right now for Azure OpenAI service. So not exactly best kind of feature parity or best kind of coverage as such, but at least we have some controls available that we can point to saying that this is a checklist. If one of my internal controls as an enterprise is to basically just do a check mark on everything that the vendor promises or vendor tells me to do, if I go through this checklist, everything is good, maybe. At least there's something to follow there. But basically, as we look at these a little bit more closer, you will see that there's a little bit of replication in there. Basically, these two ones on the bottom, the network security ones are just very similar ones over there. Resource logs, if you know Azure, this has nothing to do with the service itself. It's always on by default in there. Key Vault integration, this is actually pretty good. I have no idea why this is split into 2 controls, but that's fine. And actually, as we are seeing, there's even a third one here with the customer managed keys option in here. And then finally, there's something called data leakage and loss prevention, which is specific to this type of service, this Azure OpenAI or Azure Cognitive Service group of services only. So we'll take a look at that, and as well as these other controls here as well. Basically, very simple. It's just a kind of auditor and enterprise-friendly way of saying that you should figure out your access control, you should figure out your logs, and maybe have some network controls in place here as well. Makes sense. So for networks, very kind of simplified view into this is basically you have inbound and outbound network into this platform as a service component. Eventually, this Azure OpenAI service anyway, this thing in here, this is just a resource that you provision in your Azure subscription. If you're from like AWS world, this is like AWS account or Google Cloud project. You know, it's a thing that sits in your subscription. That's great. And usually it has a location of which data centers it's being deployed into, and then you add some configuration in there. In this case, basically, for inbound, we can actually configure something called a resource firewall. Despite its name, it's not a firewall, but let's run with this nevertheless. It's basically a short access control list. This is configurable in any other way as well. This is familiar to you with any, if you're focused on any other Azure data service before, it's the same thing. In the UI, it just says, excuse me. Yes, in the UI it just says networking. You go into a tab called firewalls and virtual networks, and then you select this instead of all networks, you go and select selected networks or even disabled in there. 2 things you need to know. There's both the virtual networks as well as IP address range. These are actually cumulative, so you can have both virtual networks listed in here, and then you can add any type of IP address that doesn't have to be included in that list of virtual networks in there. So especially if you are trying to configure all of this at scale, you do want to later on audit this part and make sure that this set of IP address ranges doesn't, for example, include consultants' home office IP addresses in here. Good. So that's very familiar to us. It puts kind of inbound network controls in there. But then there is also an option now to, even though we can't really configure the whole thing, it's not a firewall, we can't really go configure inbound, outbound, even in the level of rules and priorities and logging as we could for like an infrastructure as a service component. We do have something for outbound network controls as well. And this is the thing that was called data exfiltration prevention, or even DLP feature in there. Has nothing to do with Microsoft, like the Purview or this kind of Microsoft has other tools that are related to DLP. It has nothing to do with any other type of DLP. This is just a firewall, quote unquote. Now, instead of being a virtual network or IP address-based firewall in here, this is basically an allow list of fully qualified domain names that we can configure that our instance of the Azure OpenAI service can talk to outside. So for example, if you are downloading those dependencies from Hugging Face and that sort of stuff that we've been hearing also in this room before, that's where you could start building that access control list. There's no UI, there's no SDK, you just have to know that this is actually available to you, and then you can query. Then you can just send in the changes using the REST API by yourself. But eventually, this is going to be there. It's restricted outbound network access. Say you set it on, and then you provide it with a table of up to 1,000 fully qualified domain names, and that's it. Then you hope that it's on. Then you maybe test it. You don't get any sort of audit logs about failed or not failed attempts on this. But it's something that we can turn on. And yeah, I have this beautiful burning cloud platform sign when I think something is not exactly right, but I didn't just want to add it to every slide, so I'm highlighting some of them with that icon on the corner there. All right, encryption at rest, very similar to any other type of Azure data service. By default, you do get encryption. Again, this is the default encryption that somehow the OpenAI folks who are building ChatGPT free and the user-based free and premium, free and plus, whatever, the non-enterprise versions of ChatGPT somehow are able to disable this feature that even though as a user buying things from Microsoft you can't, or maybe they just give it to you for free. So that's called Microsoft Managed Keys, MMK, and then you can bring your own keys with customer managed keys. You point it to a Microsoft first-party key vault. No, you can't bring your own like HashiCorp vault or anything like that here by default. If you want to use that as a kind of centralized way, then you need to first have your own vault and then synchronize from there to an Azure Key Vault, et cetera, et cetera. Or if you want to control those keys yourself, then the physical keys as well, then Azure Key Vault does support that. But again, may or may not work for you there. Very kind of from Azure perspective, this is business as usual stuff. If someone wants to ask, what does this actually encrypt? That's even a better question, because I truly cannot answer that based on any sort of public information. The only kind of vague recollection there is that maybe, hopefully, the whole cluster is encrypted, but no idea if it's actually the runtime, if there is some sort of a separate storage area that is being encrypted. We don't know. But the encryption is on, so I guess auditors are happy. This is from an enterprise perspective again. Same thing for audit logging. It uses the standardized Azure feature. You go to the resource, you turn on the log export, you select from these three different items, audit logs, request and response, and trace logs. So the one in the middle here, the request and response, oops, sorry for that, spoilers. The one in the middle here, request and response, this is the one that when this is disabled, that then you have your application provides this paid privacy of not training your using your client's data. If this is turned on, then this is exactly the feature that the free and plus versions of the ChatGPT, for example, are using. And then you, of course, like on any other Azure service that uses the same logic, then you select where are you exporting those logs into. You can export those out of Azure, of course. In Azure natively, you can export them to storage account or log analytics workspace in there. Logs look like logs. There's interesting stuff that you can then go ahead and dig a little bit deeper there. Access control, just like Azure storage accounts, there is this account level super root admin key that if you get access to this key, you can do anything with that. That's called local authentication nowadays. You should not use that, but you should prefer to use Azure ADs or Entra ID on authentication with your users and your and your workloads. You can disable this. Again, no API, no UI for that, but disable local auth, set that to true. That sounds great. The only little thing, if you actually are still developing your environment, then your developers might actually use the web UI. They might go to use this Azure AI Studio that actually uses this local authentication. So if you're using that, that will break if you turn this feature on. But again, this kind of traditional enterprisey, once it's kind of waterfall level, once this is done, we ship it to production, then we turn all of these options on. That fits this workflow very well. All right, so very briefly, in Azure, of course, anything that we want, all of those features that we just saw, everything that may or may not have a UI, all of those security controls. It's great that someone goes in and looks at one point of time that if these are turned on or not. But we also need to have this continuous auditability. We need to be able to export and verify that those settings are still what we think they are, and maybe even combine that with our infrastructure as code deployments, maybe do some what-if deployments, etc. The native tool for that in Azure is the Azure Policy Framework. There are no built-in policies or policy initiatives currently for this specifically Azure OpenAI service, but fear not. This is actually under the Microsoft.Cognitive Services resource provider. So anything that has been built for Microsoft.Cognitive Services will work. It will still tag these things for you. But that means that if you have any other resources already deployed and you're only looking at Azure OpenAI, then you might get some false positives. So for example, if you previously deployed whatever Azure Search is called nowadays, cognitive search, AI search, whatever it is, then that will also get flagged with the same exact policies. You need to do some manual exclusions out of that. So that was a concern, for example, that we had in there. So if you are building your own, anything that you are doing in there, just use the Microsoft.Cognitive Services policies. Not all of the aliases are there just yet, but you should be able to do some regex magic over there by just filtering out everything that is not under Microsoft.Azure OpenAI. Here are some examples of those policies that I think are useful to repeat from these others. So again, for all of these controls, you can just reuse the existing cognitive service policy that is built in. It's first party provided by Microsoft. So from an enterprise perspective, Microsoft is responsible for updating them, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just a list of them. They are nice policies, so because they are policies, you get kind of continuous information, you get nice graphs, and you can export this sort of stuff. They're policies. If you are building these on your own, here's a couple of examples, and I have a link to a public Azure Communities GitHub repo at the end. Here's one example where we have, again, we are just using, let me actually, I don't know if you need to zoom in. I need to manually zoom in. So we have in here the Microsoft.Cognitive Services public network access that we are looking at. And then we are specifically, as you can see, here we are just filtering manually. Well, it's underneath here. We are manually filtering this type of service called OpenAI instead of search in here. Very, very small change. Here, this is actually more specific to OpenAI. We are going into the details of the deployment. We are selecting that only certain types of models can be used or certain versions of the models can be used. This is, in this case, we are looking at this a little bit more details in here. Good. And that brings me just very briefly into quote-unquote reference architecture. This is a little bit different from the Microsoft option, but basically this is pretty much putting all of these things together what we had. Of course, this is usually consumed by some sort of, this is an API application basically that you are building. You should expose that through some sort of API gateway to your UIs or your, web apps basically on Azure that are then hosting some sort of UI or web chat logic for your users. And then if this is being consumed by really people everywhere, then you can deploy that using Azure Front Door. You can put your WAF in there, etc., etc. In this picture, I just don't, I just didn't fit the API gateway, but maybe it could fit, for example, somewhere in here. And then usually you will also have some sort of retrieval augmented generation. So you will store your indexes, for example, in Azure Cognitive Search, and then you could maybe store your vectors in Azure Cosmos DB there as well. And that's it. We have 5 minutes set for questions. There's a bunch of links that you can mentally click these links, and these slides are available in the same place that the rest of the slides are. Still TBD, I guess. I am trying to put some thoughts on this together, so do follow me on them internets for some more stuff. If you are coming over here, if you're going to the AI Village, I'm sure there's lots of interesting stuff, and over the summer also at the summer camp as well. So thanks a lot, and let's jump over to questions.
All right, that's Karl Ots. As per usual, we'll take questions via Slido. If you have any, you can submit them. Instructions on how to do so are at bsidessf.com/Q&A, and that's all you'll need to do. We have one question on deck right now. How do you go about finding all of these undocumented features and configuration options available in Azure, like the FQDN allow list?
That's fantastic. My favorite, I don't have network hooked up in there, but there is, basically you can just query the regular Azure Resource Management API yourself. If you're using, Postman, whatever you're doing, I kind of have a regular kind of explorer going on every week, seeing, okay, if there's something new going on in there. If you just want to browse around, you can just go to resources.azure.com, resources.portal.azure.com instead of the regular management portal. You'll do the same. You'll see the same thing, but just with a nice little visual layout. That's what gives you that raw REST API view without the UI stuff that is on the management portal in there, and that's how you'll find it. Usually, then I'll just edit a field in there and try send it, see if it sticks. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it does.
Beautiful. Next question: what are the biggest questions and concerns large enterprises still have deploying ChatGPT via Azure? Any big fears, or has security progressed far enough?
I hope the TLDR here is that it's not far enough at all. I think there is always something to joke about having job security, et cetera, but no, there's lots of concerns, especially this kind of black boxes of, yes, there is encryption at rest, but what does it really actually encrypt? How can we be sure that the fact that there is this network control in place that it actually does what it says on the tin? For example, if you compare to Azure Kubernetes Service, you actually get visibility not just to the resource itself, but you get visibility into this managed resource group that creates all the cluster, all of the rules. If you scale your AKS up, if you add more nodes, you'll see in that resource group that there's a new virtual machine added, there are new NICs added, there's new network security groups added. All of that is visible to you, and you can audit. You can even go and log into those nodes if you want. There's no such visibility, transparency here just yet. Maybe we'll get there. Maybe we won't.
Next question: do you think other vendors outside of Microsoft have more security features, or is the landscape so sad in general?
It is. The TLDR is that this actually is cutting edge. Honestly, I do have a backup slide or somewhere else, but basically the technical features are almost non-existent from all of the vendors right now. Microsoft has a little bit more because it taps into the existing frameworks in here. From an enterprise's perspective, AWS has a good set of tools. When you're hosting your own model, you can tap into that logic quite a bit. There's always the question of, do we want to go for those own models? But that's for another discussion. On the Google side, right now the kind of the trust center material hasn't been super amicable to the enterprises that I've been working with, but I think everyone's putting all of their resources to building both the engineering and the kind of the docs capabilities right now. So I'm sure this is a very different content next year.
We got 1 minute left and one more question. Is there a CI/CD pipeline you recommend for managing services like this? Something similar to a CI/CD pipeline?
Yes, I mean it's an Azure, it's a cloud resource, so of course you should deploy everything using infrastructure as code. I had UI here because it's just a little bit nicer to show UI. For the stuff that you had those REST API calls, right now those are not available through Azure Terraform provider or the Bicep or Azure Resource Managers just yet. I mean, it's RSA week next week, so maybe something happens then, maybe something happens by Microsoft Build in 2 weeks. But basically anything that has that can be deployed using the infrastructure as code tools in there natively, obviously you should hook it up into CI/CD. Those are literally the 7 things that you can check for in your code, whether it is natively using the tools or adding like webhooks and manually check those same things that we saw from those REST queries.
All right, beautiful. That's all the time we have for questions today. Happy hour is ongoing now. Party will happen right after. All of that's happening on the 4th floor, the top floor. And I'd like to thank our speaker, Karl Ots, for the wonderful talk. And we have a goodie bag for you from our sponsor, Socket Security. Everyone, please have a great time. And I'm going to have to ask you to leave because we need this room cleared by 6 o'clock.
All right, let's go.